In this video, we'll take our new high-resolution exposure effects sim and combine it with the rest of our 654 scene and continue with the rendering. So here we are back in our XP Countdown 654 combined scene, and what we need to do at this point is introduce our new higher detailed exposure effects sim. One thing just to note before we move on to that and bring that in, you can see that, look, we're on frame 0, but in our real-time preview, which is rendering at the moment, we can already see our pre-shrunk bag. And now this is an interesting point, and it can be a gotcha. The reason we can see this on frame 0 is because a couple of things. If you remember, we have keyframed the visibility of some of our parent nulls to come on when we need to be able to view them. So if we, for example, go to our 5 burn divider and our cloth poly effects is keyframed. If we go to the basic tab, look, we have keyframed visible in editor. And at the beginning of the scene on frame 0, it is keyframed to off. But because when we have previously been making adjustments, look, we have green lighted its children. And if you green light these buttons, it overrides whatever the parent function is, which is to be invisible. So to get around that, what we do is, instead of green lighting it, I'm going to hold Control and Alt. What we want to do is just make it grey. And if we make those grey, it uses whatever the parent function is. So now look, it's disappeared from our screen and it's respecting it. So that is what we needed to do. Also, let's just have a look. Our 4 crumble, we have this keyframed as well to off. But if we just open up that null, look, again, we've green lighted it, which means it is going to be visible. It's going to overwrite this command here. So let's just change these to grey. And now we should have this back to what we would expect. Let's have a look. That's looking good. And now we've got the bubbles coming in and our splash is beginning and we're going back to our animation. Fantastic. Right, so let's just pause our real-time preview. Fantastic. So that's just a good thing to note, that these are very useful, these visible, not visible in renderer preview. But remember that you have to get the colors correct for that hierarchy to work as you would expect. Okay, so look, let's unfurl our 5 burn. So remember, we have decided to create a newer, more high-detailed exposure effect because this one we decided wasn't detailed enough. So let's bring that into our scene. So probably the easiest way of doing it would be just to open it separately and then we'll copy and paste it in. So let's go to File, Open, and we'll go to our MoGraph Countdown folder and we want to go back to 5 burn high quality. Let's bring in the last one that we did, mine is version 4, and hit open. And we don't need the emitter, all we need is the exposure effects object and the cache that's carrying the data. So let's go to the tag first and make sure we put copy tag data selected. And then we'll select that, hit Control, select the cache and hit Control C. Then we'll go to Window, back to our combined scene. Let's just make a little placeholder for it. So we'll bring in a null, and this null we will call, let's just call it the same. We'll call it 5 burn HQ. Okay, and then let's hit Control V to paste in those new objects, drag them into our new header, and let's bring that down underneath our original 5 burn. Okay, excellent. So what we need to do is we need to go to our cache object here. Let's go to the object. Let's go to the playback. Let's hit hold. And we need to adjust the offset because if you remember, if we go back to, for example, our 5 burn and cloth bit, we go to the cache, playback, it is offset by -50 frames. So we have to match that. So let's go to our high quality version, to the cache object, and let's make that the same. So now this should be in the correct position. Let's just move up our viewport. And if we just reset this, what might be useful? Okay, so look, we've got our fire starting, and yes, it's moving along with our sim. So that's in the correct position. Fantastic. All right. So at this stage, we have got our new exposure effects sim in there that's going to render really nicely. But before we get on to making our final render tweaks and adjusting the look of this to make sure it's right, let's do one more pass with a hardware render to make sure that our timing is going to be right. Because remember, we can adjust the playback timing of all of these caches. We can adjust keyframes if necessary in the timeline. So let's get this right. And the reason that we're going to do this is a very important one. It can be easy to forget what is the most important element in our scenes. We've done loads of work in getting this really nice cloth shrink. We've done loads of work getting the tearing to work and the exposure effects to look nice. And it can be easy to start thinking they are the most important elements. But of course, the hero of this whole animation are the numbers. That's what we need to be able to read. So we need to just double check that we've got that timing correct. So let's run off a quick hardware render of this. So what do we want to see? It's going to be useful, I would imagine, that we have our, let's go to our 6 splash. Let's see that in the viewport. Let's reactivate for the 6 splash our, do you remember we put this display tag on, which allowed us to use wireframe. So let's do that, which means that when we get to our 5 fill, we'll see it. But then we switch off the 6 splash, and the 5 burn cloth becomes visible. So let's just move on to a frame. Look, here's the cloth. So let's reactivate our wireframe for that cloth as well. Good. And now exposure effects is visible as well. So that's looking good. In the exposure effects, actually, let's go and just go to the display mode. We're already looking at the fuel, which is just the fire. Let's put fuel and smoke. Okay, and I'm guessing that we're probably going to need to about 100, a bit more than 100 frames actually. Let's go to 120. So this is taking a little bit of time to jump to our new frames, and that's because we've introduced another cache with our high quality exposure effects, which is pretty big. This cache is around, let's have a look. It's not too bad actually. It's about 576 meg, so it's not the end of the world, but we've got lots of cache data here which we are having to jump through. All right, so let's move forward to say frame 130. And this will probably be right. 100, yeah. So now look, everything's out of the frame just about, but this is going to be enough for us to get the timing. So we'll go to our render settings. Let's change the renderer from cycles to hardware open GL. We don't need to save anything. The output, we're going to go 0 to 130. That's fine. Okay, that's looking good. So let's just come out of that and we will render to picture viewer. And this will render through relatively quickly, but I will just pause it for now, come back when it's finished, and we will see what this animation feels like. Okay, so that took a couple of minutes to run through. Now we can get an idea of this timing. So our splash is looking good. And arguably, now look, this is important. Remember, let's not look at the elements that are the coolest. Let's look at the numbers, because that's what we're concentrating on. And what we need to view here is, this is the important transition. Can we see this 5 in its entirety for long enough before it wipes into the 4? And arguably, I'm thinking that this transition begins a little too quickly. Now, remember, we actually made some adjustments to speed this up, but I'm thinking that we are going to just prolong the paused area where we're just looking at the 5 with the wobbling liquids before this burn starts. Let's just play it through a few times to get a feel for it, and let's look at the 5. So here's the 5. Yeah. So I'm saying we need an extra couple of beats. 5, then. Yeah. So it's coming in here. I'm arguing we maybe need it to come in perhaps 15 frames later. Half a second later would give us more of a feeling of that 5. It's going to feel a little bit too abrupt. And remember, we've got this nice movement in that liquid, so we've got interest in the scene. It's not just going to be static. But yeah, so I'm saying that we need half a second longer on that 5 before our fire kicks in. I mean, possibly even more, but my gut feeling is half a second's going to work for us. Okay, so we're going to do that. Now, also, this fire is arguably spreading slightly too slowly. Let's just watch it a couple of times. Is this spread too slow from the 5 to the 4? We want it to whip up. I mean, maybe not. I think we could speed this up slightly. And of course, we can do that. We can do that with the cache, not a problem. So, yeah, my gut is saying we need a bit more speed on that transition. Okay, very good. So this is why it's really important to do these hardware renders, because you don't want to set your final render going, take 5 or 6 hours to render, even sometimes overnight, come back and realize that your timing's all wrong. So that was a very good exercise. So what do we need to do? There's a few things that we need to do to alter this. And to do that, let's go back to our startup view. So the first thing we decided was that we want our, let's have a look. We want our 5 burn, which is our cloth and our exposure effects simulation. We want this to happen 15 frames later. So that means that remember we have, look, this offset value. So let's put minus 65. Okay. I'm just going to deactivate our high quality exposure for now. Let's just switch that off because we'll just get better playback. So now we should have new timing. Everything else has remained the same, but our rip, we're going to have that additional half a second before we start moving up. And there it goes. Okay, let's just have another look. Now remember, there's one thing we need to do here, because if you remember, we have keyframed. We can see it moving here, our linear field. Now, this is controlling the effect of our poly effects, which is making our polygons from our cloth disappear. But of course, we've changed the timing of this now. So we need to change those keyframes. It's really simple to do. Let's go back to our 5 burn. Let's go to our linear field. And here are our keyframes between 50 and 120. So let's go, we'll adjust these, but let's do it more precisely than doing it in this little mini timeline. Let's do it the more precise way. Let's go to the window menu. We'll go to the timeline F-curve. Let's maximize this. So here we go. Here are all our keyframes. And they start on 50 and they end on 120. But look, remember, we've offset this. So let's just select them all. And I'm going to click it and hold Shift, which means that they can't move up and down. We can just move them side to side. And we need to move them 15 frames. So they're on 50. Let's move them to 65. That's it. All we need to do. Let's close down the timeline. So now when we play through this, our linear field should be correct for the new timing of our cache. And it is. Here it comes in, and then they start disappearing. Very nice. Perfect. So what we also need to do now is go to our high quality exposure effects, switch it back on, and in the cache, we need to go to playback, and we need to change this also to -65. So now everything is lining up again. Good. So that's that keyframe sorted, but there's still a bit more work to do now, because we have decided that our fire perhaps needs to move a little bit more quickly. But do you know what? Let's just, because it's so quick to do, now that we have retimed that, let's just do another hardware render, and let's just deactivate the high quality exposure so it's quicker to calculate. And do you know what? It's so quick with this one. Let's do it with the high quality. That's fine. And we're going to re-sim this via a hardware render to have a look at this new timing. So I'll pause this again, come back to you when it's done, and we'll see if that new timing is working better for us. Okay, so here's our new retimed sim, and let's have a look. So what we're concentrating on here is, do we see the 5 for long enough before we go into our 4? Let's have a look. Yeah, that's much better. So 5, then 4. And then the 4 will move down and collapse into the 3. So now that we've got a render of our kind of high quality exposure effects, which has a bit of more movement in it anyway, I'm saying that our timing is going to be fine for that. That's looking really nice. Okay. So one last thing we need to do is we just need to make an adjustment. So our high quality exposure effects is virtually the same shape as the low quality, but it is slightly different, and it is slightly higher. And if you can see, our linear field, perhaps a bit hard to see in this render, I have a feeling our linear field might just need a little bit of adjustment so it perfectly matches our new exposure effects sim. It's hard to see in this view, so let's close that down, and we will come back to our actual viewport view. So here we go. So here comes the linear field. Let's have a look. We don't really want any kind of remnants of, let's just pause it there. So look, let's just come back a little bit. And back a little bit more. Do you know what? Let's go so we can see a little bit more clearly. Let's turn off the wireframe view on our cloth. There we go. So this is going to allow us to see this a little bit more clearly. So actually, I mean, it's looking pretty spot on as it was, which is really good, really handy. Okay, that's looking all right. It's looking all right. Is it getting rid of this? So we don't want any breakup before the fire hits it, basically. Let's have a look. No, I think we're looking okay. Ah, look, there's a tiny little bit of breakup here before our fire has actually got to it. Now, this is happening so quickly. It's very unlikely that you're going to see this, but look, let's do this properly. So we'll go to Window. Let's go to our timeline F-curve. Let's just make this a little bit smaller. So what we want to look at is, let me just resize this so we're going to be able to see both. So let's get our linear field. Here are our keyframes, and it's going to be our Y. So look, it's coming in too quickly. So let's move this down a bit. So you see that's slightly adjusting the movement of that linear field, which means that now we haven't got the breakup of those polygons. So that's not looking too bad. Let's just go through to make sure that that hasn't messed up anything else in this. Fire is here. I think that's okay. Perhaps coming in a little bit too quickly at the bottom. So let's just go back to our timeline F-curve and just extend this ever so slightly. Okay. Let's just go forward a little bit. Yeah, that's sorted that out. Yep, this is in fire, so that's okay. Yeah, that's in fire, so that's all right. Okay, so I think we're in pretty good shape there. And obviously you can make as many adjustments as necessary to get that right, but it looks pretty good. Right, so now we have got that sorted, what we need to do is start looking at our actual render settings to get everything ready in our materials, in our Cycles 4D settings, and actually get this rendering so we can add it to the bits that need compositing. So the first thing we need to do is we need to finalize our exposure FX look, because remember, we just put the standard exposure FX fire and smoke material on there without making any adjustments at all. So let's have a look at that first. So let's go to a frame where we've got some smoke and fire in the scene. Somewhere like that is going to work well. Let's go to our layout. I'm going to change it to my Cycles 4D layout once more. There we go. Let's hit render and see what we've got. So just on default, it's looking quite nice. But one thing that I would argue is we need to adjust the smoke. It's a little bit too thick for this. And we perhaps might want to make it look a little bit hotter, but we can adjust that in a sec. Just before we do, let's just go back to our render settings and revert back from hardware OpenGL settings to Cycles 4D. Okay. Just so there's no confusion later. Right, so let's have a look at this. If we go to our burn high quality, look, we put this material on. If we go down to our material manager, it is the Exposure FX fire and smoke presets that ships with Cycles 4D. So let's just have a look at those nodes. So any node tree, if you're not used to node editing, looks a little bit intimidating at first, but it needn't, because once you start working through them, they're far less complex than they seem. So I'll zoom in a second, but what we've got here are two elements. This is one element, which is controlling our smoke, and this is the second element, which is controlling our fire. And both of those elements are being fed into an add shader, so it's adding them, the smoke and the fire together, and then it's pumping that into the volume of the object that it is on, which is our exposure FX. Okay, so not as complicated as it looks. Let's have a look at the smoke first. So the smoke starts with a point density texture node. And what this does, it just reads the information that Exposure FX is generating. So we've got this set to Exposure FX smoke, and we're taking the density information that it's created and we're feeding it into, each one is being fed into a maths multiply node. Okay? And this maths multiply node, which is multiplying that density by 100, is then being fed into the density of a volume scatter. And this multiply node, which is not multiplying it as much, so it'll be less dense, is being fed into a volume absorption. Okay? Those two are being added together and then sent into our overall add node. So this is our smoke settings. And all we have to do to make some adjustments is this. I want our smoke to be less dense. So let's just reduce this multiply number. So I'm going to go to our maths multiply, and let's just divide it by 5. So that'll give us 20. Okay, so the volume scatter is now going to have a lower value. Let's hit play to render that. It doesn't look hugely different because we need to reduce the volume absorption as well by the similar ratio to get the same look but thinner. So let's divide this one by 5, and then we're going to see a much lighter looking smoke. And there we go. Fantastic. So that is the only adjustments that we need to make there. Let me just show you as well So we don't actually need to have this color ramp. What this is doing, it's taking the density value of the smoke and it's remapping it from black to white to these color values, and then it's sending that color to the color of the volume scatter and the color of the volume absorption. And what you're going to see is when this smoke starts to thin out, let's just go to a frame further on, which has much kind of thinner smoke. We have to be a little bit patient here when we're scrubbing through, because every time we move forward, Cinema 4D is having to read all of that cache data, and we're almost on, I think it's probably more than a gigabyte per frame in this instance. So it takes a little bit of time for Cinema 4D to load that information back up, but there it is. So now we're on a thinner stage. Let's hit play. And where the smoke starts to thin, you're going to start seeing the colors of this gradient in that scatter and that absorption. So that looks really, really nice. Okay, so that is controlling the smoke. This lower down bit is controlling the look of the fire. So again, we've got a point density texture node, but this time it's referencing the exposure effects burn, which is the fire. That is being remapped to this color ramp, which is effectively kind of compressing that density information. It is then being multiplied to make it thicker, and it's then being sent in to control the strength of an emission shader, a light shader. So if we want the fire to be less bright, all we need to do is reduce down this temperature. Let's put it down to, say, 10. And it's going to be much less bright. There we go, look. Let's put it back up to 60. That was a good number. And it becomes bright again on 60. And it's being coloured using a black body model, which gives you a nice kind of natural fire colour. But you don't have to. Look, if I hold Alt and just drag across to cut that connection, it'll just take its colour from this colour here. And then you could change this to, I mean, you could have this whatever colour you wanted. Look, you could have a green fire. Let that reload in. And now I've got green. So we've got a huge amount of control, but the black body look is very nice. It's realistic, and that's looking good. Very good. So I'm pleased with that, and I think that's looking fantastic, especially now that we've resimmed this. But the final thing I want to do with our fire is to ensure that by the time the transition has happened and this number 4 has been revealed, that all of the smoke dissipates away. So let's just hit pause in our real-time preview. And let's go to a frame where I'm just going to deactivate that cache for a second. And the exposure effects. Let's go to a frame where that transition should have fully gone. So I'm looking in my real time. Let me just make that viewport a bit bigger. So we're looking in the viewport here for a frame when all of the cloth has disappeared. So there it's gone. So at this point, we really want that smoke to start dissipating from there, because we're going to start having a crumble of our 4. So at this point, let's just reactivate the exposure and the cache again. And this again was just going to take a little while to load in, because it's having to, Cinema 4D is having to read all of this cache data, which is pretty intense. All right, so that's the kind of the final little bit. Let's hit render to see where we are. So at this point, we want the smoke to start kind of dissipating away. So the way we can do that is quite easy, actually. We can just go to... Let's just dolly in here. So we can just go to our 2 multiplies, which are multiplying the density of the smoke. And we can just keyframe these down to get rid of that smoke. So let's put a keyframe on this one and a keyframe on this one. I've actually changed the value of that, because I was dollying in. So that wants to be, it was 13 divided by 5, 2.6. That's what we want. So what had happened there, the reason that had changed to a 1 is because I use the 1, 2 and 3 keys along with my pen to move and to zoom in and out. And you have to be careful with this. This is a common Cinema 4D gotcha, that if you have one of these boxes highlighted and then you hold 1 to move around, it can change that number. And that is what happened in that instance. So that was a good spot. Right, so let's pause this real-time preview. Let's move forward a frame to somewhere where this smoke and fire, we really want rid of it. So again, let's just wait. It's going to take a bit of a while before it loads in all of that exposure effects cache information. Let's just give it a couple of seconds whilst that happens. And at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to keyframe back down these two values. So this one will keyframe down to 0. This one will keyframe down to 0 as well. And then what will happen in the render is that that'll just kind of fade out as we go into the next kind of transition of our animation, which is going to be the 4 crumble. Okay, so there it is. So let's put this down to 0, keyframe it, and then let's pick our other math multiply, put that down to 0 and keyframe it, and then we're going to get that fade. So that's going to work really well. So let's just hop back to a frame that is in the middle. Hit play. So this point, it kind of should be halfway through that density fade of both that smoke, absorption and scatter. Yeah, and it's going to kind of fade away. Fantastic. So that is our smoke and fire sorted. So now let's move on and finalize some of the other parts of the scene, and then we can start looking at our render settings. So what we need to do is establish how many samples we're going to want to render our scene as clearly and as high a quality as possible, but also to give us some decent render times. So let's just go back nearer to the beginning of our scene. And what we need to do is let's just make a little bit more room for our real-time preview to make it bigger here. So what we're looking at is our glass splash material. And we can see that we got rid of those fireflies earlier by putting some clamping on the indirect lighting. But now what we need to do is address some of this noise. You can see this speckly noise that is within this material. So we do that by raising the amount of samples. Now, I've had my real-time preview set to 10, which is a nice balance between speed and quality. But obviously for final render, this will need to be higher. So let's just, what you want is, you want it to be as low as possible, but to give you a nice result. So let's try this on, say, I don't know, 25 samples. So that has leapt up from 100 in this path tracing sample number to 625. So considerably more. But you can see as it chugs through this is getting cleaner and cleaner and cleaner, and that noise is reducing. So that's good. And look, we've got to 625, and that's looking pretty nice. There's a little bit of noise there, but a little bit of noise can actually be a good thing. A lot of people often get a bit obsessive trying to remove noise completely. But if you think about it, most things that are shot with a camera have some element of noise. And so it can actually add some realism to have a little bit of noise in your render. What you don't want is it flickering all over the place frame to frame. So that's looking pretty nice on 25 samples. But I'm saying, look, this is not necessarily going to be for final production output. I'm going to reduce this down to say, see if we can get away with 22, which is going to reduce that render time quite considerably. So we'll try it on 22, just go forward a frame to reset it. So now it's going to solve. And look, by putting it from 25 to 22, now it is only 484 of these path tracing samples instead of the 600 odd it was with the higher amount with the 25 samples. So this is going to render an awful lot quicker, and it's still looking pretty decent, slightly more noise, but for our intents and purposes, I think that's going to be fine. What I'd urge you to do is just to use your real-time preview as kind of your first draft guesstimate of what your samples are going to be. And then what you need to do really is get into your actual render settings and do some test renders to the picture viewer at full resolution to get a really good idea of how that noise is looking, and also render a few frames so you can animate through it to see how that noise animates from frame to frame. All right, but this is looking pretty good for us, and for our well, for my render, I'm going to be happy with this amount of noise. That's not a problem. Okay, so let's set up our render settings then. So what we need to do, let's just pause that real-time preview, and we will go to our render settings, and we need to go to Cycles 4D, and we need to set up a couple of things. Okay, so first of all, let's just go through these bit by bit what we need to do. So we'll just collapse all of these menus. So first of all, device. If you have an NVIDIA graphics card with CUDA and it's a fast card, you're much better off changing your device from CPU to CUDA. It'll run and render more quickly. I've got, in this machine, I've got two 1080 Ti's, so that's going to work really well. So let's close that down. Then for integrator and sampling, let's open up this. So this is the area in which we added our indirect clamping to get rid of those fireflies. And this is where we need to put in our final sample number. And this is the same samples as the one that we have in our real-time preview here. So I decided on 22 for mine. You might want to go higher, but I'm going to go with 22. All right. And actually, just while we've got this integrator and sampling open, what I want to show you is this volume step size. Now, we weren't experiencing this in our sim because we had quite a high resolution exposure effects simulation. But if you are seeing obvious striping patterns in your exposure effects smoke, that is an indicator that your volume step size is too high. You're kind of effectively seeing slices in your volume. So if you are seeing those, you want to reduce this step size down, which will get rid of those and it'll make it a much higher quality volume. The down point to that is that it will obviously take longer to render. Okay, let's go back to our light paths and ray depth, and we can leave this as is. We were getting nice results with that. Let's go to our film menu. We need to ensure that we've got transparent glass selected here to make sure that that glass and transparency renders correctly. Very good. And everything else can remain as is. So what we're going to do is render this, but we're also going to do one multipass as well. And what we want to do is we want to get out the exposure FX fire pass, because we might want to just correct that away from the rest of the render when we get to the compositing stage. So that's really simple to set up. Our render passes in Cycles appear under the render elements menu. So let's click on that. And this is what we want. We want to take the emission pass. Now, the only emission object that we see in the viewport in our scene is the exposure effects fire. If we had our lights visible in the scene, they would appear in the emission pass as well. But for us, the only one is going to be that fire, and it's going to be quite useful. So we're going to tick that, and we might want to use that later. Fantastic. So there's a bit of a two-step process to be able to get these render elements to actually render along with your image. So we'll get on to that now. So we'll move to the output. Now the output is, I'm going to render mine at 720p, which isn't obviously the biggest resolution in the world. You can do yours at 1080p if you like. You can go up to 2K, 4K if you really want to, but obviously the render times are going to go up incrementally with those changes too. I'm going to do mine at 720p, and make sure that your frame rate here matches your project frame rate. So just to check that, we can go and say Control D, which brings up your project settings, and my frames per second I've got set to 30 frames a second. So make sure that matches in your render settings. And we're going to do a frame range, and we'll do manual, and well, we keyframed the kind of opacity of our smoke down to about frame 160 when it disappeared. So let's just put manual from 0 to 160. Okay, right, so let's go to our save dialog now. So we'll click on save because obviously we want to save these files, and we want to render an image sequence, so like an image sequence for every frame, an image for every frame. We don't want TIFFs are great because they can be 32-bit and carry loads of information, but they tend to be pretty massive files. So unless a client tells me otherwise, I will always go with OpenEXRs, and we can go down to a 16-bit, and that's going to give us plenty of data to manipulate this in the comp. Excellent. And we want to have an alpha channel in our scene. So yeah, we'll have alpha channel ticked. And now we need to give it a file path. So let's click on here. And what we need to do is we need to go to our MoGraph countdown. Let's go to render builds, combined, and let's put a new folder in here. So I'm going to call this render. All right, and let's just click on this to get the name. We'll go into our render folder, and do you know what? Instead of putting this as our file path, let's just come out of here for a second. So what we have got, let's just come out of here. So we've made some changes, and we've created our render settings. So I'm just going to File, Save Incremental. Okay, so we're at this point. And now I'm going to File, Save As. And this Save As, I'm going to call it version 13. And then I'm going to put render settings at the end. And now I'm going to know that this Cinema 4D scene file haven't made any kind of any simulation changes to it or scene changes. It's version 13 with all of the render settings sorted out. And I always like to separate out the final kind of scene that I'm rendering with that. So let's hit save. Very nice. All right, so let's go back to our save output. We'll go back to this file explorer. Let's go back to our MoGraph countdown, render builds, combined, render. And so what I'm going to call this is this one, 13 render settings. There we go. And we don't need to actually put render settings. We'll put 13 in the actual name. All right, very good. So that's going to be fine. So every file is going to be called this, XP Countdown 654 combined version 13 _ 001 EXR and then 002 XR 3 and up in the sequence. Let's hit save. So that is it for the beauty pass, and the combined pass with the alpha channel will be saved there. But now we have to set up a pass that's going to render this render element, this emission pass that we did in Cycles. So the way we do that is a couple of things. We have to select multipass here, which opens up a new window in the save dialog. So what we can do, we can just put the same file path in the multipass image as we have for the beauty, the regular image. And what we'll do is change the format from PSD to OpenEXR again. And we don't, well, actually, it doesn't really matter in this instance because we've only got one pass. But multi-layer file means that it will put all of your separate multi-passes into one file. And then you have to separate all of those passes out at the compositing stage in After Effects or whatever you're in. I very rarely use multi-layer files. I prefer to deselect that. And so if you do have multiple multi-passes, like emission and diffuse and shadows, they will appear as separate image sequences for each different multipass, and that's just the way I prefer to work. In our instance, we've only got one. We've only got the emission pass anyway, so it actually doesn't make any difference. Okay, layer name as suffix is important. We want that ticked, and that means it's going to take this layer name and then add emission pass on the end to it. Very good. So that's that. Now there's one more stage we have to do before this will save it, because this multipass needs to know how to look at the Cycles emission pass. And it does that via the post effects layer. So we need to go to multipass here, And this is telling Multipass which Multipass do you want to do, and the Cycles ones appear under Post Effects. So we need to click this on and have it highlighted. So now we're ready to go. We have got our output ready with the aspect ratio, frame rate, and what frames are rendering. We've got our save dialog ready. The combined beauty pass will be put here. The multi-pass image will be put here. This is going to be our emission layer, the fire from the exposure effects. We've got multi-pass selected, obviously. We've got post effects selected, so the multi-pass knows how to find the Cycles 4D information, and we're pretty much ready. So let's just go back to Cycles and just double check once more. So we've got emission, yeah. We've got device set to CUDA. We have got our clamping on. We've got our step size as we want it. We've got our ray bounces as we want them. And we're doing our transparent glass correctly. So there, we are ready for business. All right, excellent. So let's close that down. Just let's hit save. So we've got all those render settings save. And now we can start rendering this to the picture viewer. So here it comes, and I'll just stay with you for this first couple, and we'll just get an idea of how long this is going to take. All right. If in our picture viewer, you can see here's our beauty pass being rendered. This is the first part of the splash, and there's a little bit of noise in there, but nothing that we can't live with. And if we go to the layer tab, we can now see that we've got the two layers we have. If we hit single pass here is our alpha pass, which is embedded within our beauty combined layer. And here is our emission pass. Now, at the moment, there's no information in that emission pass, and that's because in the scene early on, there isn't anything. The emission will only appear when the fire starts at around whenever it was, frame 60 or 70. Okay, so let's go just back to history. So what we're looking at here is at the moment 19-21 second render. So this will creep up when we've got more transparent materials filling the frame, and it'll especially get heavy when we've got smoke and fire. But that's not looking too bad. Okay, so we'll leave that one rendering away with those passes. The next time we see this is when we will bring in these image sequences into After Effects to do our combining of the elements. So here we are in After Effects. That render is finished, took about 3 hours, and look, we've got our entire sequence here for just this part of the animation. So this is cached to RAM, so let's just hit play and have a look. So it's all looking really nice, and then we've got our flames which melt away that plastic and it disintegrates. So that's looking really good. I'm pleased with that. So let's just pause it. We've got a certain amount of noise which obviously animates frame to frame. For production, I would say that there's perhaps slightly too much, so we maybe would want to go up to that 25 samples amount. Remember, we rendered this at 22 samples. But all in all, I think this is looking really good. And obviously, we haven't done any colour correction on this. This is just what's come straight out of cinema, and it's looking fantastic. And so we have this pass, and then also we have, remember, we did our emission pass. So here comes our emission pass, which is just the flames. And that allows us to do a little bit more intricate compositing and colour correction once we get to that stage in the project. Excellent. So one thing just to point out here, remember we created a kind of a higher resolution exposure effects simulation to make it look better, and it does. It looks really nice. If we go back to the animation, we've got this fantastic smoke and fire coming across our material, and it looks really good. And the way in which we did this is we kind of spawned all of those new particles from the position of the existing cloth ones. It looks nice. There's one flaw with this, which we do lose with this type of detailed technique. And what we're not getting is, if you see, here's our number 4, we're not getting that kind of lingering smoke and fire as the particles catch to the edge of the number 4, which looks really nice. And that's one thing with this technique that we have lost. Now, it's not the end of the world. It still looks really nice. And once we've composited it and done some tricks to make this fire look better, it's going going to look fantastic. But just to point out, we do lose some of that interaction with the fire and the underlying 4. And so obviously the way to get that back is to, right at the beginning when they're setting this up, doing all of the simulations, the cloth, the fire, everything at a higher resolution, a higher particle count, and then you're going to get that really nice interaction. But for us, I'm very pleased with this. I think it's looking good. The timing looks good. We've got our wipe away to reveal the 4. We're in a good place to start putting this together with some of the rest of the renders. So in the next video, we will move on and we will look at rendering the 6 fill, which will then lead into this 6 splash. So that's going to be coming up next.